Hello, and welcome to the Hey Boomer Show, which is live every Monday on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and then available the next day on every podcast app. My name is Wendy Green, and I am your host for Hey Boomer. And Hey Boomer is a show for those of us who believe we are never too old to set another goal or dream a new dream. I am on a mission to support and inspire adults in the second half of our lives. We are learning together and sharing stories, facing new beginnings, and confronting endings and transitions. We are evolving rather than retiring, and we are defining this next stage of our lives. My guest today is Omkari Williams, who went from working as a political consultant and fundraiser to the owner of her own consulting and coaching firm, teaching women to use their stories to make change in their personal lives, their professional lives, and in the world. She helps women define and develop their unique expression of activism, and then put a lifestyle-friendly path in place that allows them to put their voices in motion and influence change. Growing up, my dad had his own advertising and public relations firm in Florida. I remember when he handled the campaign for governor back in the 60s. We would go with him to rallies where the candidates spoke. I remember riding in an antique car in a parade, carrying signs for Robert King High for governor, and feeling the excitement of campaigning. I was 13 years old, and the idea of participating in the democratic process was cemented into my DNA. I have continued to participate at rallies, working for candidates and causes. The naivete of that 13-year-old has changed, but I have not lost hope. I still believe that we all have to do what we can if we want to continue to live in a free society. I also want to thank all of those who walked as part of the Hey Boomer Walk to End Alzheimer's team. We had David and Doris and Scott and Anne and Joyce and Al and Prudence and Janet and Kathy and Byron. And we had our California team, Melanie and her friends. So thank you to all who donated that were unable to walk. And thank you to all the walkers. The pictures are all up on Facebook. And I want to keep this walking momentum going and celebrate Grandma Gatewood's 3-time through hike of the Appalachian Trail. First, at the age of 67, and her final hike at the age of 76. Grandma Gatewood was a survivor of domestic abuse, and the organization Prime Time for Women uses this hike as a fundraiser. This year, the money raised will support breast cancer awareness in the Cumberland Valley. So join Hey Boomer in supporting Primetime for Women. We're going to take a 2-mile hike at Carrick Creek in Table Rock on Sunday, October 23rd. To register, it's just $25 to support their work, and you can register at primetimeforwomen.org/donations/virtual-hike-registration. And if you didn't get that, you can always drop me an email and I'll send it to you. Send me an email at wendy@heyboomer.biz. So let's go. Let's keep walking. And with that, let us meet Omkari. Hi, Omkari.
Hi, Wendy.
Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here.
Thanks. Let me give them a brief bio from you.
Okay.
So Omkari is a speaker, writer, podcast host, and coach for activists, both experienced and new, helping them develop and sustain their activism. Omkari says our stories are bridges between us and others and are foundational in creating societal change. When we learn how to leverage the power of our collective stories, we can create meaningful change and help bring justice to the world. On her podcast, Stepping into Truth, she interviews people doing activist work in areas from abortion rights to zero plastic waste. And her writing has been featured online in Elephant Journal, My Empowered World, Women for One, and Tattooed Buddha, and in print at Savannah Magazine and Paprika Southern. And I am so honored to have you here. So I'd like to start by having you tell us a little bit about how you initially got involved in politics and activism, and then what facilitated your move into becoming more of an activist coach?
Well, my involvement in politics, I mean, there are two ways to look at that. I grew up with a father whose work was humanitarian relief. And when you grow up with a dad who's a humanitarian, your understanding of the world is probably a bit different than that of your peers, because all around me were conversations and stories about situations in the world and how we were engaging with them and how politics mattered, because the decision makers are the ones who chart our course. And so after deciding that I did not want to do my first career any longer, which was acting, I decided to volunteer on a campaign. And after the campaign was over, I thought, you know what, this feels really good. It was a really energizing, if exhausting, experience. And I just kept doing it. And I started raising money for pro-choice Democratic candidates. And that felt really good until it didn't. And the shifting point for me with that was the Citizens United decision, when unlimited money just poured into politics, because that is the way of traditionally, the more money you put into something that comes from unregulated sources, the more corrupt it's going to be. And I feel like we have seen how that has borne fruit here in the United States, and it's deeply dangerous to democracy. So that started to sort of sour me on the whole thing. And I started thinking, if you keep doing this work, you're probably going to go to hell for this. So I shifted into the other thing that was always really important to me, which was activism. And I'd been very active in social justice as a kid. You know, I mean, from the time I was a little kid doing trick or treat for UNICEF, and then I did political theater in college, and then did political theater after college. It always felt like what was required is to do what you can do. And even though I had a career as an actor, and even though I had a career as a fundraiser, I am personally an introvert. And so something I noticed was that people like me were not really participating as much as I felt would be beneficial for everybody. And I started thinking about that and asking some of my introvert friends about that. And mostly what I heard was they had an idea of activism that didn't include them. And that's not how I see it. So now my work is really to show people who identify as introverts or highly sensitive how they can make activism a part of their life in a way that is sustainable for them. And although most of my clients are female, I work with anybody across the gender spectrum. The point is, I deeply believe that we all have a contribution to make, and that the world desperately needs our contribution right now. We are clearly at a tipping point on so many different fronts. And so sitting on the sidelines doesn't seem like a viable response to the circumstances we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and I want to define the terms that you use, the introvert and the highly sensitive people, because I think listeners may have the idea that an introvert is just shy, and that's not true.
No, I'm an introvert. I'm not shy.
I tend more introvert too.
Yeah, when I say introvert or extrovert, what I really am talking about is how do you recharge?
Right.
So when I have expended a lot of energy because I'm teaching a program or I'm giving a speech, what I do to recharge is go home, plop myself down on the couch, depending on the time of day, with a glass of wine or a cup of tea, and I just cocoon. I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want to have to engage with anybody else because that takes energy. And the way I restore my energy is to just be quiet, to just read a book or watch something on Netflix with no redeeming social content. You know,
Right.
I
Right.
just need to chill, right? So
Yes.
that's what I do. And my extrovert friends, they're much more likely to want to go out and hang out with other people because that's how they recharge. So that to me is the difference. And then when I talk about highly sensitive, I'm really talking, I mean, another word would probably be empath, right? People who walk into a room and can feel the energy of the room really clearly. And they, if they are not careful, kind of take on everybody else's energy. And that can be, well, it's not can be, that's exhausting. That, you know, it's hard enough to manage our own energy. Imagine if you're taking on the energy of everyone around you. So figuring out ways of being true to yourself and still making your contribution, that's a lot of the work I do in the world.
So let me just dig into the highly sensitive people a little bit, because that, I mean, I think most of us have a sensitivity
Yeah.
to, you know, things will affect us, and what's going on in the world right now
Mm-hmm.
deeply affects me. I know I feel it and I get anxious and scared, and then what am I going to do about it? But I don't think I would qualify as or be labeled as highly sensitive, because I don't take in everything around me. So do you think there are degrees to highly
I
sensitive?
do. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like pretty much anything else. It's not black or white. There are degrees. And people who are highly sensitive, I mean, we all know some of those people, and we'll say, oh, you know, they're very sensitive, or, you know, they're whatever word we choose. We understand that they feel things very, very deeply. And sometimes people get mocked for that because people feel like, oh, you're just so fragile. And it's really not that. It's really, I think of it like this. I feel like it's the way I think of it is that you feel like sometimes your skin is really thin, so it's not filtering out the things that skin is meant to filter out. And so everything hits you and lands really powerfully. And you don't just brush something off because everything feels really intense. And that's the difference that I experience. Uh, you know, when I think autism is the far end of that spectrum of highly sensitive, and it's all about degrees. And highly sensitive people are more sensitive to stimuli that other people just don't even notice than others. And so, since it's on a spectrum, I try to be very careful to not give a quality to it. It's not good, it's not bad, it just is.
It just
And it's not something you need to fix. It's something that if that's you, you need to understand so you can navigate it and be successful in how you move through the world.
So, like you said at the beginning, a lot of your introvert friends were feeling like they can't participate because activism seems, you know, out in the street yelling, holding signs. How do you help navigate this kind of, or help them find their sense of activism for introverts and highly sensitive people?
A few years ago, as I was thinking about this, I thought, you know, people think that to be an activist, you have to be willing to stand on a stage. And I thought that is so not true. And I had the idea of coming up with a quiz so that you could find yourself in the spectrum of activism. And I created what I call the activist archetype quiz. And I've categorized 4 broad groups of people. One is the headliner, one is the producer, there's the organizer, and there's the indispensable. And these 4 types really sort of span the gamut as I understand it with activism. So the headliner is obvious, that's the person standing on the stage who's making the speech or whose face is the front of a movement. The producer, I think of that as the person who's behind that person on the stage, and they're sort of making sure that all of the pieces are in play. I mean, here's where my acting background comes in. It's like, oh, it's like a movie. And the producer's making sure that so-and-so has this job and so-and-so has that job, so everything gets done. The organizer is the person with the specific job, right? They could be the person at the PTA who's going to be in charge of making sure there are cookies on that table for the bake sale, just the cookies. Someone else is doing the pies, right? And then the indispensable, that's the vast majority of people. That is the category of people who are making the phone calls in the office, making sure that there's postage for the mail, knowing where the bathrooms are on the march route so that the marchers know where they can use a facility, making sure there's water for everyone who's marching. They are the people doing the things without which all of this would fall apart and nothing would matter. To give you another example, so Greta Tunberg is a headliner. She also happens to have autism, which seems a bit contradictory.
It does.
But she cares enough about her cause, which is saving the planet, that she is overriding her natural resistance to being in the spotlight in service of something that is bigger than she is. But Greta Tunberg, without the millions and millions of other kids and adults now who have joined in her cause, would just be a kid sitting outside the Swedish parliament on Fridays for a school strike. Nobody would have ever heard of her. The indispensables, those millions of people whose names and faces we're never going to know, they are the reason that Greta Thunberg has the platform she has. They are a critical piece of this. And that is true across the board. And I just think it's really important that we acknowledge that there's no one group in those archetypes that is more important than any other group. We all matter. We all have a role to play.
So I took that archetype quiz, and it turns out I am an indispensable by a big majority, which I thought was interesting at first, because I think people see me as a leader, person out front.
As the headliner. Mm-hmm.
But I am, like I told you before we got on, I spent the weekend addressing and writing postcards for the upcoming election. That to me was very satisfying.
Yes.
I will go to marches and demonstrations, but I do not want to be the one giving the speech and pulling them together. So it's interesting. Although Hey Boomer is a platform for me, for sure.
Yeah. But I think the thing that's important to understand is that given certain circumstances, we will all step out of our most comfortable role into another role. Think of it this way. You may be someone who is very conflict averse, but let's say you're on public transit with your kid, and someone starts harassing your kid. You're going to jump in and defend your kid. It doesn't matter that you are conflict averse. The circumstance is going to change your behavior. Mm-hmm. And that's true for all of us. We all have moments where we do things that are out of character, and I use that very advisedly, for us, but they are in character for us under certain circumstances. It's just not our norm. It's not our baseline. So for you, having this podcast, it's filling a need for you And also, really, you're talking to one person at a time,
That's
right?
right.
You're
That's right.
having a conversation.
And that's
This is not the
perfect.
same as standing up on a
That's
stage in
right.
front of 10,000 people.
Yeah, and it's perfect. So when someone reaches out to you,
Mhm.
and they say, I want to do something, but I'm scared. I don't know what to do. What's the process? How do you guide them?
Well, the first thing we talk about is what they're really interested in, right? What are the things, the causes that call to them the most profoundly? Because, as in the example I gave you about defending your kid, the causes that are most important to you will motivate you to push a little bit outside of your comfort zone if you need to, and you may not need to. But if I understand what your causes are, then we can look at ways that you can support those causes without putting yourself in a position where you actually feel afraid anymore, right? If someone says, "Oh, I'm really interested in making sure that kids have free lunch at school," that's great. And I'm not going to say, okay, well, then what I need you to do is go to your local legislature and stand up in front of the legislators and make a speech. If that's not your thing, I'm going to say, okay, can you write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper about how important it is that children be nourished in school because that actually correlates directly to their capacity to learn? Or can you get together with one friend and come up with a plan for raising funds to do a little tiny campaign in your newspaper, run a little tiny ad or something like that? Or can you, if that's your cause, decide that what you're going to do is go and listen at the local school board meeting and understand what their issues are so that you can formulate a better response, or so that you can make your voice heard when they are there and they're deciding this issue. There are a whole bunch of different things that you could do that don't push you to the point of feeling like I am way out of my depth here and I'm just going to stop. Because that's what I'm trying to get people to understand. You don't have to go so far in one direction that the only reasonable thing to do is quit. You can just do what you do and do it in small increments and do it consistently. And how important that is. It's incredibly important. We live in this go big or go home society,
Mm-hmm.
and that is just rubbish. I mean,
I know. I think what you're saying is super important because everybody's input matters
yes,
in whatever way you can do it. Going out to vote, getting friends to the polls, writing letters, everything counts. Doing
it
nothing
does.
just hurts your own heart too when
It
you do
does.
nothing.
I mean, because we all know it's like I could have done something, and especially those elections where you hear that someone won by 3 votes, and you're thinking, oh, I should have voted and brought my 2 friends with me. We could have made a difference here. I should,
Mhm.
the regrets are terrible. I
Mhm.
mean, it's bad enough if something happens and you don't like what happened, but you did everything you could to come to a different outcome. But if you didn't do anything and something
Right.
bad happens, there's this feeling of sort of irresponsibility is, I guess,
Mhm.
the best way I could describe it. And that's what I'm trying to have people avoid feeling, is that regret that comes from not having taken responsibility for making the contribution that you can make and that only you can make,
Yeah,
you know?
I like that. So there are so many topics. I was looking at your podcast and you've talked about racial justice, getting out the vote, separation of church and state, Black Lives Matter, Asian American Pacific Islander communities, Sandy Hook Promise. There are so many ways people could get involved and make a difference that sometimes, Omkari, it gets overwhelming. We just feel like there's so much. How do I what do I do?
I so wish there were fewer choices, but here we are. So The thing that I do in my classes and in my private work with people is I have them use what I call my Noah's Ark rule. And my Noah's Ark rule is that you only get to choose one or at most two causes to focus on at any given time. We are individuals, we have limited time, we have limited resources of time, energy, and money. And we need to be able to spend those resources wisely. And if you're working on more than one or two things, you're probably spreading yourself way too thin. I mean, the people I talk to on my podcast, they focus and they make an impact because they focus. You mentioned Sandy Hook Promise, and that is one of the episodes that really sticks with me. I mean, Sandy Hook happened not that far from where I am, and it was a terrible, terrible, terrible day. And there have been relatively few days since then that it hasn't come up in my consciousness in some way because of our epidemic of gun violence. Mm-hmm. And Sandy Hook Promise was founded by two parents of children who were murdered in Connecticut that day. And this is their focus. This is what they do. They work on this issue. And they've been incredibly successful in getting children to understand how to identify the warning signs of violence and then be able to report it to authorities or, teachers, parents, whomever, and get help for the student before something catastrophic happens. And it's such an incredibly important thing. But then, I also have people who are doing work on very small things that most of us don't think about. I interviewed someone whose issue is the ocean and protecting the ocean. And what I realized the more I interviewed different people was there are 8 billion people on the planet, and there are as many permutations of major causes as there are people. So we can pick our thing and we can rest comfortably knowing that of the 8 billion people, someone else is doing everything, right? There's nothing that is falling through the cracks because we're all interested in different things. So we can actually focus our efforts. And when we do that, we're giving ourselves the best opportunity to make a real impact. So one or two causes. And then just one other thing about that. When we started putting babies in cages on the southern border of the United States, that honestly was not on my bingo card. And when that showed up, it shifted my focus. And one of my other causes dropped off for a while. It's like, okay, no, I need to work on this. And then after a couple of months, when the pieces were in place and the lawyers who needed to be involved were involved and everyone had systems, then I went back to my other cause, and that one was taken off my plate. So one or two, you're not wedded to them. You can shift them up as you need to, but having one or two that you're really dedicated to allows you to dive deep. It allows you to build long and lasting relationships with other people doing the work. And it allows you to just focus and not feel so tapped out at the end of every single day.
That is a really good example because I know I'll experience those kinds of things where you see something and you're saying, oh my gosh, how can I add something? But I like that example that you can put something on hold for a little while.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not going to go away.
I know. Well, my big focus right now is the election, getting out the vote, trying to save our democracy. That's my big focus. And
that is a worthy focus because without democracy, everything else we're discussing kind of becomes a moot point.
Yeah. I'd like to suggest another group for you besides introverts and highly sensitive, and that would be much older adults. Like I look at my mother, she's 92, and she still is writing letters to the congressman. She's still writing letters to the editor. And I think a lot of people, once they're in their late 80s, 90s, they start to think, well, I'm not going to be here much longer. I don't have a voice anymore. It doesn't matter. That could be an interesting new discussion for you.
I think so. I think especially because people of that age, my grandmother lived to be 102 and was as sharp as a tack till a couple of days before she died. She was advocating for better food in nursing homes in New York City, where she was living in a New York City nursing home. And she said, the food is atrocious and they should do better. And she would write letters, and she had a meeting or two with the mayor. I mean, she was a pistol.
Good.
Yes. Grandma was no joke. And yeah, it's a sort of a family thing, you know, but I think that one of the things that we sometimes forget about people who are older is how much wisdom they have, how much they've seen, and how much they can just let roll off their backs because they have perspective that some of us still don't have. And I think that intergenerational work is incredibly important. So teenagers right on up to octogenarians and beyond that's sort of my idea of who we should be looking to work with and learn from, because they have perspectives that we may not have, and they have a stake in things differently than we do. Mm-hmm. You know, if you're in your 80s or 90s, you might be looking at this and saying, I need my grandchildren and great grandkids to have a decent world. And if you're a teenager, you're looking at this and going, oh God, this is horrifying. I don't want to live on a desert planet. What are we going to do, right? Whatever the cause might be. So I think it's really important to not age discriminate and to actually broaden our groups by bringing in people across the age spectrum.
Yeah, and I think when I started this show a few years ago, I was thinking, you know, the kids. I was them. You know, I had that passion that we could do anything. Well, I think as we get older, we start to realize that we can't necessarily do anything, and that there are cycles, right? It's cyclical. And I mean, the cycle we're in now is a pretty scary cycle. And so hopefully we can work our ways through it. But I like that idea. So do you work with organizations that are doing intergenerational work?
I do, actually. There's a museum in Philadelphia. It's called the National Liberty Museum. And I have created part of their curriculum for them. And they are working with kids in 4th through 8th grades on activism, really, on being a change maker. And so I've worked with them on that. And I've done also projects with them for educators of elementary school and middle school age students, helping them create ways of engaging their students in activism. And it's part of the work that I really enjoy the most, because kids are amazing, right? They're so smart and they're so dedicated and they're so willing and open in ways that we can sometimes forget to be as we get older. And so it's always a good experience for me to work with kids and have them remind me that just because I had an idea doesn't mean it's necessarily the best idea ever. And I mean, it usually is, but you know, but they might have an idea that knocks mine out of the park, you know, so let's go. Let's see what we can all create together. And I love that.
Yeah. And I want to ask you a question about the racial divide, because when I was very involved in the women's movement, it seemed like it was a majority white women. With the League of Women Voters, it seems like it's majority white women. And, you know, just like intergenerational work, how can we bridge that gap so that we're all working together and increasing our understanding of what it means to be Black and what it means to be white and, you know, what it means to be Asian Pacific?
Yeah, that is, here we are at the challenge of the United States in the 21st century. And I see it a couple of different ways. One thing I definitely believe is that when you are raised in a racist society, and that is what we have all been raised in, the systemic racism is built into the fabric of this country. There's no way, I don't care who you are, what you look like, you don't come out of that unscathed. We all have to notice where we have racist tendencies in us. And it's one thing to notice that, and it's another thing to beat yourself up for that. And I don't think that's helpful. When we start pounding on ourselves for having a racist thought or having said something that was inadvertently racist, the thing to do is understand where we went wrong, understand the thought behind it, start to do that inner work on our own, make amends to the person we harmed, and keep moving forward. And, the women's movement, as any movement is going to be reflective of its time, right? So the women's movement looked like the time, because at that point in our history, women were the group people were noticing as being oppressed. But when people thought about women, they thought primarily about white women, because when people thought about people, they thought primarily about white people. Mm. So that shift to what does this mean for women who are not of the dominant culture has been a long time coming. And it's, Black women in the early days of the women's movement spoke to this, but they weren't really heard. And there were so many voices coming from white women. For one thing, it was certainly still a majority white society at that point. But for the other thing is, those were the voices people were accustomed to hearing. And we're starting to break that cycle, but those cycles do not break easily. Someone once said that no man who was sane or sober ever gave up power willingly. And I think that is true. And I think part of what we're grappling with now is being able to be sane and sober and giving up power. I think that is one of the things that is being confronted by white people as they say, maybe it's time for us to take a step back and let other voices come to the forefront. Maybe it's time to start looking at how our will has been imposed without even being aware of it. And I don't find it helpful to beat ourselves up when we make a mistake. I just don't. I think it shuts us down to learning, and it shuts us down to community. But I also don't think that we get a pass for being idiots. And at this point, to pretend that this is not a society where we really need to grapple with race head on is flat out racism itself, or you're just sticking your head in the sand. There's just no way around that, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, we certainly are hearing more voices about that now. And those of us who are open to learning are, involved in conversation and reading. And but I think you're right. It's going to take some time to come together.
We change fast, humans, we don't change quickly. We change when the cost of not changing becomes too high to tolerate. And that can be as a society or it can be as an individual. But we just need to be realistic about what is and what isn't so. And I feel very strongly that when we look at the conversation that's happening around race, we need to understand that no sane person is blaming anyone alive now for creating this system. The system was in place long before any of us showed up on the planet. But even though we didn't create it, we are responsible to do our part to take it apart, because we know it's not working. We know it's not just. We know it's detrimental not only to individuals, but honestly to the planet itself, because you can literally tie all of our social ills to white supremacy and the belief that some people have that simply by virtue of being white and often male, they get to do whatever they want, take whatever they want from other people, from the planet itself. And that thinking is how we are depleting resources and how we are exploiting other humans and how we are just generally being terrible. I mean, we need to unravel that and create a society that's just, because white supremacy will never, ever, ever work for everyone. It wasn't intended to.
Oh, that's true. It was definitely intended to keep certain people in power and certain people down.
Including white people down, including less privileged white people.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you, how do I want to say this? With the work that you're doing, if you could dream about where this is going to take you in another 10, 20 years, what would that look like for you?
My dream would be that every well-meaning person on the planet was involved in some form of activism in some tiny way every single day. They were just doing some little thing, something as small as picking up the trash outside of their office because of their commitment to a healthy, clean environment, or something as big as going and working to clean the ocean. I mean, anything. Just that everyone was doing something, and doing that in the understanding that we are a society that functions best when we are working for the health and well-being of everyone rather than just the privileged few.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's a beautiful dream, and I hope that we all achieve that. Let me show people how they can find your website. So that's Omkari, OMKARI, Williams.com. You'll find the activist archetype quiz on there. You'll find some of the classes that Omkari offers, and of course, her podcast, Stepping into Truth, which I think you do monthly now, right?
Yes. I'm working on a book. So the podcast is, it's gone to a monthly format.
Well, it's very good. So I encourage everybody to subscribe. And this is the audience. They love that kind of stuff. So, and I encourage you to subscribe to Hey Boomer also. Those of you who might be newly listening came because of Omkari. My website, or to subscribe to our website, is bit.ly/heyboomer-subscribe. And I hope you'll come walk with us on Sunday, the 23rd. Just email me. I will send you the information, Wendy at heyboomer.biz. And let's honor Grandma Gatewood's escape from domestic violence and her courage to walk those trails. So next Monday, my guest is me. I am doing a solo show, and I'm going to talk about being the first girl page in the United States. And I served in the Florida State Senate because they wouldn't have me in Washington, D.C. I was 16 years old and fairly naive, and it was quite an experience, the whole journey to get there, and then once I was there. So I look forward to sharing that with all of you. A little bit nervous about it, of course, but I think it will be interesting. And, so we've been talking about activism with Omkari, and then Rhonda the week before with her work uncovering sexual abuse in the prison systems in Atlanta. So I'm looking forward to talking about, I was probably a reluctant activist at 16. So I hope you all find the story interesting. And I want to leave you with the belief that we can live with passion, live with relevance, and live with courage. and that we are never too old to set another goal or dream a new dream. Thank you, Omkari, for what you shared today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And my name is Wendy Green, and this has been Hey Boomer.